The crystal chandeliers sparkled like diamonds above the massive ballroom. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway of the Wellington mansion, each one worth more than most people make in a lifetime. Tonight was the night of their annual charity gala, and everyone who was anyone in the city had come to see and be seen. David Wellington adjusted his gold cufflinks and smiled at his reflection in the hallway mirror. At 35, he had inherited more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. His family owned Wellington Industries, a company that had contracts with half the businesses in the country. Tonight's party wasn't really about charity. It was about showing off their wealth and making deals that would make them even richer. The guests walked around in designer clothes that cost more than a car. They sipped champagne that was older than some of the people serving it. Everyone talked about their vacation homes, their private jets, and their latest business victories. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, mixed with the soft music from a live orchestra. But while the rich guests enjoyed themselves upstairs, a different world existed downstairs and in the corners of the mansion. The kitchen buzzed with activity as dozens of workers prepared food and cleaned dishes. Servers moved quickly through the crowd, making sure every glass stayed full and every plate stayed clean. Security guards stood quietly in the shadows and cleaning staff worked to keep everything perfect. Among these workers was a woman named Diane. She was 43 years old with kind eyes and gentle hands that had seen years of hard work. Tonight, she wore the simple black uniform of the cleaning crew. Her job was to empty trash cans, wipe down surfaces, and make sure the bathrooms stayed spotless throughout the evening. What none of the wealthy guests knew was that Diane had a secret, a big secret. Diane had been working as a janitor at Wellington Industries for almost 3 years. Every morning she would arrive early to clean the offices before the important people came to work. She would empty their trash, vacuum their floors, and dust their expensive furniture. To them she was invisible, just another person in a uniform who they barely noticed. But Diane noticed everything. She saw the papers they threw away without thinking. She heard the conversations they had when they thought no one was listening. She learned about their business deals, their problems, and their secrets. Most importantly, she learned what kind of people they really were when they thought no one important was watching. The truth was that Diane was far from just a cleaning lady. Her real name was Dr. Diane Thompson, and she had a PhD from one of the best universities in the country. She was also the owner and boss of a technology company that was growing faster than anyone could believe. Her company, called TechGuard Solutions, helped other businesses protect their computer systems from hackers and cyber attacks. But why would a successful business owner work as a janitor? The answer was simple but clever. Diane had learned long ago that the best way to really know a company was to see how they treated their workers. She had started the janitor job as a way to study Wellington Industries from the inside. She wanted to know if they were the kind of people she could trust with a major business deal. What she had discovered over 3 years was both surprising and disappointing. The Wellington family and their top managers were not the honest, hard-working people they pretended to be in public. Behind closed doors, they made fun of their employees, cheated on their taxes, and treated anyone they saw as beneath them with cruelty and disrespect. Tonight's party was the perfect example. As Diane worked quietly in the corners of the ballroom, she watched the wealthy guests treat the servers and cleaning staff like they were not even human. They snapped their fingers to get attention, never said please or thank you, and made messes, on purpose just to watch someone else clean them up. David Wellington was the worst of all. Diane had watched him for 3 years, and she knew he was a man who had never worked hard for anything in his life. Everything had been given to him because of his family name. He had no respect for people who actually worked for their money, and he seemed to enjoy making others feel small and unimportant. As the evening went on, more and more guests arrived. Politicians who wanted donations, business owners who wanted contracts, and celebrities who wanted to be seen at the right parties. They all smiled and laughed and pretended to care about the charity. But Diane could see it was all fake. They were there for themselves, not to help anyone else. The charity they were supposedly supporting helped provide school supplies for poor children. But Diane knew from the papers she had seen in David's office that most of the money raised tonight would never reach those children. It would go to administrative costs and overhead expenses that were really just ways to keep the money for themselves. Around 10 o'clock, Diane was cleaning near the main bar when she overheard David talking to his friends about a big business deal. They were discussing a contract worth over $1 billion, a contract with her company, TechGuard Solutions. What they didn't know was that she was the person they would be meeting with next week to sign that contract. This TechGuard deal is going to make us so much money, David said, laughing as he took another drink. These tech people are so desperate to work with established companies like ours. We can probably get them to agree to almost anything. His friends laughed and agreed. They talked about how they planned to change the contract terms at the last minute and how the tech nerds probably wouldn't even notice. They made jokes about small technology companies and how easy they were to trick. Diane kept cleaning, but inside her anger was growing. These people had no idea who they were really dealing with. They thought they were so smart and so powerful, but they were about to learn a very important lesson about respect and consequences. As the night continued, Diane watched and listened and remembered everything. She saw which guests were rude to the servers and which ones were kind. She heard which business leaders were honest and which ones were planning to cheat their partners. Most importantly, she was getting ready to teach David Wellington and his family that success means nothing without character. The party would end in a few hours, but the real story was just beginning. Tomorrow, Diane would return to her real life as Dr. Thompson, successful business owner and respected leader. And next week, she would sit across from David Wellington in a conference room where he would finally learn who she really was. But tonight, she was still just Diane the janitor, invisible to the wealthy guests who had no idea that the most powerful person in the room was the one they treated with the least respect. The night was getting late, and the wealthy guests at the Wellington party were drinking more and talking louder. Their true personalities were starting to show as the alcohol made them forget their manners. What had started as polite conversations were turning into cruel jokes and mean-spirited comments. Diane continued her work, moving quietly through the crowd with her cleaning cart. She had learned over the years to become almost invisible when she worked. Rich people rarely looked at janitors directly, which made it easy for her to overhear their private conversations. She was wiping down a table near the main seating area when she heard David Wellington's voice getting louder. He was sitting with a group of his closest friends, all wealthy business owners like himself. They had been drinking expensive whiskey for the past hour, and their conversation was becoming more and more inappropriate. "You know what I love about having parties like this?" David said, gesturing around the room with his glass. "It reminds everyone where they belong in life. Look at all these people working so hard to serve us. It's the natural order of things." His friends laughed and agreed. One of them, a man named Richard who owned several restaurants, pointed toward the servers carrying trays of food. "Some people are born to serve and others are born to be served. It's just how the world works." Diane felt her stomach tighten, but she kept working. She had heard comments like this before during her 3 years at Wellington Industries. These people truly believed they were better than everyone else simply because they had money. As she moved closer to empty a nearby trash can, David suddenly noticed her. His eyes focused on her uniform and her cleaning cart, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Speaking of people who know their place," David said loudly, making sure his friends could hear him. "Look at our hard-working cleaning lady over there. I bet she's grateful to be in the same room as successful people like us." The group turned to stare at Diane, and she felt their eyes examining her like she was some kind of exhibit in a museum. She continued cleaning, hoping they would lose interest and move on to another topic. But David was just getting started. The alcohol had made him bold, and he seemed to enjoy having an audience for his cruelty. "I wonder what goes through her mind when she sees all this wealth," David continued, his voice getting louder. "Do you think she understands how hard we work for our success? Or does she think money just falls from the sky?" Richard laughed and joined in. "She probably thinks we're just lucky. These people never understand that success takes intelligence and skill. They think anyone can do what we do." A woman sitting with them, David's wife Victoria, decided to add her own cruel comments. Look at her clothes. Look at her hands. You can tell she's never had anything nice in her life. Some people just aren't meant for better things. More people around them started listening to the conversation. Instead of telling David to stop, they began laughing and making their own mean comments. It was like watching a group of school bullies picking on someone they saw as weaker. "I bet she can't even read the names of half the companies represented here tonight," said another man. "The level of education in this room is probably beyond her understanding." David stood up, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. "You know what? I feel sorry for people like her. They spend their whole lives cleaning up after their betters, never realizing they could improve themselves if they just tried harder." The group erupted in laughter. They were treating Diane's presence like entertainment, making jokes about her intelligence, her appearance, and her worth as a human being. Other guests nearby started joining in, creating a crowd of wealthy people, all laughing at one woman who was just trying to do her job. "Maybe we should give her some life advice," Victoria suggested with fake sweetness. "Tell her how she could better herself and maybe work her way up to serving food instead of cleaning floors." David clapped his hands together like he had just thought of something brilliant. "That's a wonderful idea. Hey, cleaning lady," he called out loudly. "Come over here for a minute." Diane's heart was racing, but she had faced worse situations in her life. She slowly pushed her cart toward the group, keeping her face calm and professional. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle bullies was to stay quiet and let them reveal their true character. "We were just talking about success and hard work," David said, speaking to her like she was a child. "We wanted to share some wisdom with you. You see, all of us here have worked very hard to get where we are. We've studied, we've made smart decisions, and we've earned our success." The group nodded and made sounds of agreement, like David was giving an important speech instead of just being cruel to a working person. "Now we understand that not everyone can be as successful as us," David continued. "But that doesn't mean you can't try to improve yourself. Maybe you could take some classes, learn some new skills. Who knows? With enough effort, you might even work your way up to a better job." Richard jumped in with his own fake advice. "The key is having the right attitude. Instead of feeling sorry for yourself, you should feel grateful for the opportunity to learn from successful people like us." Victoria nodded seriously, like she was sharing profound wisdom. "And you should always remember that there's dignity in honest work, no matter how simple that work might be." The whole time they were talking, Diane noticed that they never once asked her name, never treated her like a real person with thoughts and feelings. To them, she was just an object they could use for their entertainment. Other guests had formed a circle around them now, watching the show. Some looked uncomfortable with what was happening, but none of them spoke up to defend Diane. They were all too worried about their own social status to risk making David Wellington angry. "Do you have anything to say?" David asked Diane with mock politeness. "Any questions about how to improve your situation in life?" Diane looked around at all the faces staring at her. She saw the cruelty in their eyes, the way they were enjoying her discomfort. These were people who had never faced real hardship, who had never had to work for anything meaningful in their lives. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I understand perfectly." And she did understand. She understood exactly what kind of people they were. She understood that they had no respect for anyone they saw as beneath them. She understood that they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about treating people with dignity. As the laughter continued around her, Diane quietly returned to her work. But inside her mind, she was already planning for next week's meeting. These people had no idea that they had just humiliated the one person who held their company's future in her hands. The party continued, but for Diane, the real show was just about to begin. The next morning, Diane woke up in her beautiful penthouse apartment overlooking the city. The sun was streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across her modern furniture and expensive artwork. The contrast between this luxurious space and the small, humble apartment she pretended to live in for her janitor identity was striking. She made herself coffee in her state-of-the-art kitchen and sat down at her marble dining table. The events from the previous night kept playing in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. The cruel laughter, the mean comments, the way they had treated her like she was nothing more than an object for their entertainment. But instead of feeling sad or angry, Diane felt something else. Determination. Today was the day everything would change. After finishing her coffee, Diane got dressed in one of her sharp business suits and drove to her real workplace. TechGuard Solutions occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office building in the heart of the business district. As she pulled into her reserved parking spot marked CEO, she smiled at the irony of her double life. The security guard at the front desk greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson. How was your evening?" "Very educational, Robert," she replied with a knowing smile. "Very educational indeed." Diane took the elevator to the top floor, where her corner office overlooked the entire city. Her assistant, Patricia, was already at her desk with a stack of important documents and a fresh cup of coffee waiting. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson," Patricia said professionally. "I have the final contracts ready for your review. The Wellington Industries meeting is scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon." Diane picked up the thick contract folder and felt its weight in her hands. This wasn't just paper and ink. It was the future of Wellington Industries. The deal they were about to sign would make her company their exclusive cybersecurity provider for the next 5 years. It was worth $1.2 billion, making it the largest contract in Wellington Industries history. "Patricia, before we proceed with the meeting, I need you to pull up everything we have on Wellington Industries and their leadership team," Diane said, settling into her leather chair. "Of course. Is there something specific you're looking for?" Diane thought about the cruel faces from the night before, the way they had laughed at her pain. "I want to know everything. Their business practices, their treatment of employees, any legal issues they've faced. Leave no stone unturned." For the next 2 hours, Diane reviewed files, reports, and background checks that her team had compiled over the past 6 months. What she found was even worse than she had expected. Wellington Industries had a long history of treating their workers poorly. They had been sued multiple times for workplace discrimination, but they always settled out of court to keep the stories quiet. They paid their lowest-level employees barely enough to survive while giving their executives massive bonuses. The company had also been investigated for tax evasion 3 different times. Each time, they hired expensive lawyers who found legal loopholes to help them avoid paying their fair share. While small businesses struggled to pay their taxes, Wellington Industries found ways to hide their profits overseas. Most disturbing of all, Diane discovered that David Wellington personally had been involved in several scandals. He had been accused of harassment by former employees, but his family's money and influence had made those accusations disappear. He had cheated business partners and destroyed smaller companies just because he could. The picture that emerged was of a family that believed rules didn't apply to them. They used their wealth and power to hurt others without any consequences. They saw regular working people as disposable, as objects to be used and thrown away. Diane closed the last file and leaned back in her chair. Through her office window, she could see the Wellington Industries building across the city. In just a few hours, David Wellington and his board of directors would walk into her conference room, expecting to sign the biggest deal of their careers. They had no idea that the woman they had humiliated the night before was about to hold their company's future in her hands. Patricia knocked on her door and entered with another cup of coffee. "Dr. Thompson, the Wellington Erie. Team just confirmed they'll be here at 2 o'clock. Should I prepare the usual signing ceremony setup?" Diane smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to deliver justice. "Actually, Patricia, I want you to change the setup completely. Instead of the formal conference room, let's use the smaller meeting room. No flowers, no champagne, no celebration. Just a simple table and chairs. Is everything all right? This is our biggest contract signing ever." "Everything is perfect," Diane replied. "But I have a feeling this meeting is going to be very different from what the Wellington team is expecting." As the morning continued, Diane reviewed the contract one more time. Every page represented months of negotiations, legal reviews, and technical specifications. Her company had promised to protect Wellington Industries from cyber attacks, to safeguard their customer data, and to keep their business secrets safe. But protection required trust. and trust had to go both ways. At noon, Diane's legal team arrived for a pre-meeting briefing. Her lawyer, Michael, spread the contracts across the conference table and began reviewing the final terms. "This is an incredible deal for both companies," Michael said enthusiastically. "Wellington Industries gets the best cybersecurity in the business, and we get a contract that will secure our company's future for years to come." "Michael," Diane said carefully, "what would happen if we decided not to sign this contract?" Her lawyer looked confused. "Not sign? But we've been working on this for 8 months. Both sides have already agreed to all the terms. Dr. Thompson, is there a problem I don't know about?" Diane stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, David Wellington was probably having lunch, confident that his company's biggest deal ever was just hours away from being completed. "Let me ask you something," Diane said to her legal team. "What's more important, making money or standing up for what's right?" Her chief technology officer, James, spoke up. "Well, ideally, we can do both, but Dr. Thompson, you've always taught us that integrity comes first. You've turned down profitable deals before when the clients didn't meet our ethical standards." Diane nodded. That was exactly right. Over the years, she had built TechGuard Solutions on a foundation of respect and fairness. She treated her employees well, paid fair wages, and only worked with companies that shared her values. The question now was whether Wellington Industries shared those values, and after last night she knew the answer. At 1:30, Patricia knocked on her door again. "Dr. Thompson, the Wellington team has arrived. They're in the lobby now." Diane took a deep breath and straightened her jacket. The moment of truth had arrived. In just a few minutes, David Wellington would walk into her conference room and discover that the cleaning lady he had humiliated was actually the CEO he needed to impress. "Send them up, Patricia. It's time for Mr. Wellington to learn who he was really talking to last night." David Wellington stepped out of his luxury car feeling like he owned the world. He had spent the morning celebrating with his friends, talking about how this contract would make them richer than they had ever imagined. The $1 billion deal with TechGuard Solutions was supposed to be the easiest money they had ever made. He walked into the TechGuard building with 3 other members of his board of directors. They were all wearing expensive suits and confident smiles. To them, this meeting was just a formality. They had already decided how they would spend the profits from this contract. "I still can't believe how easy this has been," David said to his chief financial officer, Robert, as they rode the elevator up. "These tech companies are so desperate to work with established businesses like ours. We could probably ask for anything and they'd agree to it." Robert laughed and nodded. "I heard the CEO is some woman who started this company in her garage. Probably never dealt with real business people before. This should be simple." The elevator doors opened, and they walked into the elegant reception area of TechGuard Solutions. The space was modern and professional with clean lines and expensive furniture. David looked around and felt even more confident. This company was successful, which meant they needed Wellington Industries more than Wellington Industries needed them. Patricia, the assistant, greeted them with a professional smile. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Dr. Thompson is waiting for you. In the conference room, please follow me." As they walked down the hallway, David noticed the awards and certifications hanging on the walls. TechGuard Solutions had been recognized by major technology organizations and government agencies. Their client list included some of the biggest companies in the world. "Impressive operation," whispered Richard, David's marketing director. "No wonder they want to work with us. A partnership with Wellington Industries will give them the credibility they need to really grow." They reached the conference room, and Patricia opened the door. "Dr. Thompson will be with you in just a moment. Please make yourselves comfortable." The 4 men sat down at the polished conference table. In front of each of them was a copy of the contract, thick and bound in leather covers. David picked up his copy and flipped through it casually, not really reading the details. He was too excited about the money to focus on the fine print. "Gentlemen," Patricia announced from the doorway, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Diane Thompson, founder and CEO of TechGuard Solutions." The door opened and Diane walked into the room wearing a sharp black business suit. Her hair was styled professionally, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had built a successful, company from nothing. She looked every inch the successful CEO that she was. For a moment, David didn't recognize her. He was expecting to meet some nervous tech entrepreneur who would be grateful for his attention. Instead, he saw a poised, professional woman who clearly belonged in the business world. But as Diane sat down across from him and looked directly into his eyes, recognition slowly began to dawn on David's face. Something about her seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place where he had seen her before. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Diane said in a clear, strong voice. "Thank you for coming to our offices today. I'm Dr. Diane Thompson, and I've been looking forward to this meeting for quite some time." She opened her own copy of the contract and looked across the table at David. "Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and my company. I have a PhD in computer science from MIT, and I've been working in cybersecurity for over 15 years. TechGuard Solutions has protected some of the most important companies in the world from cyber attacks." David was still trying to figure out why she looked so familiar. There was something about her face, her voice, that reminded him of someone. But he couldn't concentrate because he was too busy thinking about the money this deal would bring him. "Dr. Thompson," David said with his most charming smile, "we're very excited about this partnership. Wellington Industries has been looking for the right cybersecurity company, and we believe TechGuard Solutions is exactly what we need." Diane smiled back, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret that others didn't. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Wellington. Tell me, what exactly do you know about my company?" David glanced at his colleagues, feeling confident. "Well, we know you're one of the top cybersecurity firms in the country. We know you have an excellent reputation, and we know you understand the value of working with established companies like ours." "I see," Diane said slowly. "And what about me personally? Do you know anything about my background?" The question seemed strange to David, but he answered anyway. "We know you're a successful entrepreneur who built this company from the ground up. Very impressive for someone in your position." "My position?" Diane repeated, her eyebrows raising slightly. "What exactly do you mean by that?" David was starting to feel uncomfortable, though he wasn't sure why. "Well, you know, as a woman in technology, it must have been challenging to get this far." Diane leaned back in her chair and studied David's face carefully. "Mr. Wellington, I want you to think very carefully. Are you absolutely certain we've never met before today?" Now David was really confused. He looked at her more closely, trying to remember where he might have seen her. There was definitely something familiar about her, but he couldn't place it. "I don't think so," he said hesitantly. "Should I remember meeting you?" Diane stood up slowly and walked around the table until she was standing directly behind David's chair. "Let me help refresh your memory, Mr. Wellington. Last night you attended a charity gala at your family's mansion. Do you remember that?" "Of course," David said, turning to look at her. "It was a wonderful evening. We raised a lot of money for charity." "Do you remember the cleaning staff that worked at your party?" Diane asked, her voice getting quieter but more intense. "Do you remember how you and your friends treated them?" Suddenly, David's face went completely white. The memory came flooding back to him like a wave. The cleaning lady they had made fun of, the cruel jokes, the way they had humiliated her in front of all their friends. "Oh my God," he whispered, barely able to speak. "That's right, Mr. Wellington," Diane said, sitting back down across from him. "I was there last night. I heard every word you said. I heard every joke you made. I heard how you talked about people who work for a living, people you think are beneath you." The other men at the table were looking back and forth between David and Diane, trying to understand what was happening. David's hands were shaking as the full reality of the situation hit him. "You see, gentlemen," Diane continued, her voice calm and professional, "for the past 3 years I've been working as a janitor at Wellington Industries. Not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to know what kind of people you really are when you think no one important is watching." David tried to speak, but no words came out. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "And what I discovered," Diane said, looking each man in the eye, "was very disappointing. Last night was simply the final test, and I'm afraid you failed." The silence in the conference room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. David Wellington sat frozen in his chair, his face pale as paper. The other board members looked confused and terrified, finally understanding that their biggest business deal ever was about to fall apart. Diane reached for the leather-bound contract in front of her and slowly closed it. The sound of the cover shutting seemed to echo through the room like a door slamming shut on their future. "Dr. Thompson," David finally managed to whisper, "I can explain what happened last night. We had been drinking, and sometimes people say things they don't really mean when they've had too much alcohol." Diane looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn while cleaning his office for 3 years. "Mr. Wellington, I've been observing you and your company for a very long time. Last night wasn't an exception to your character. It was a perfect example of who you really are." She stood up and walked to a large screen on the wall. With the touch of a button, it displayed a presentation she had prepared. The first slide showed photos of Wellington Industries' office building. "For 3 years I cleaned your offices every morning before you arrived," Diane said, clicking to the next slide. "I emptied your trash cans and I saw the documents you threw away without thinking. I heard your phone conversations when you thought no one was listening. I watched how you treated your employees when you thought it didn't matter." The slides showed charts and graphs that detailed Wellington Industries' business practices. Employee turnover rates that were twice the industry average. Salary gaps that showed executives making hundreds of times more than their lowest paid workers. Legal settlements that had been kept secret from the public. "What I discovered was a company that succeeds by stepping on others," Diane continued. "You underpay your workers, you cheat your business partners, and you treat anyone you see as beneath you with complete disrespect." Robert, David's chief financial officer, tried to salvage the situation. "Dr. Thompson, surely we can work something out. This contract is important to both our companies. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." Diane turned to face him directly. "Mr. Roberts, you were sitting right next to David last night when he made fun of me. You laughed along with every cruel joke. You called working people naturally meant to serve. Do you remember that?" Robert's face turned red and he looked down at the table. There was no denying what had happened. "The truth is, gentlemen, that character matters in business," Diane said, returning to her seat. "When I sign a contract with a company, I'm not just agreeing to provide services. I'm entering into a partnership that requires trust, respect, and shared values." She picked up a different folder from the table and opened it. "Over the past 6 months, while we were negotiating this contract, I've also been documenting Wellington Industries' business practices. What I found was deeply troubling." The room was completely silent except for the sound of papers rustling as Diane flipped through the folder. "Your company has been sued 17 times in the past 5 years for workplace discrimination. You've settled every case out of court to avoid bad publicity. You pay women and minorities significantly less than white men for the same work. You fired employees for trying to form unions. And you've covered up safety violations that put workers at risk." David tried to interrupt, but Diane held up her hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. Your company also has a history of breaking contracts with smaller businesses. When you find a better deal, you simply refuse to pay what you owe and force these small companies to sue you. Most of them can't afford to fight Wellington Industries in court, so they just accept the loss and sometimes go out of business." She pulled out another document and placed it on the table. "This is a report from the Department of Labor showing that Wellington Industries owes over $2 million in unpaid overtime to your workers. Instead of paying what you owe, you've spent twice that amount on lawyers to fight the claims." The 4 men sitting across from her looked like they had been hit by a truck. Everything she was saying was true, and they knew it. "Dr. Thompson," David said desperately, "we can change, we can do better. This contract would help us modernize our business practices." Diane shook her head slowly. "Mr. Wellington, you've had decades to do better. Instead, you've chosen to build your wealth by taking advantage of others. Last night, when you thought you were talking to someone who couldn't fight back, you showed me exactly who you are." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Do you know what the most important thing about cybersecurity is, gentlemen? It's trust. When a company hires us to protect their data, they're trusting us with their most valuable secrets, but trust has to go both ways. Turning back to face them, Diane's voice became stronger and more determined. I cannot in good conscience partner with a company that treats people the way Wellington Industries treats people. I cannot trust my company's reputation to a business that has no respect for basic human dignity. David's voice cracked as he spoke. You don't understand. We need this contract. Without it, Wellington Industries might not survive. We've already promised our investors that this deal would happen. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before you decided to humiliate someone you thought couldn't defend herself, Diane replied calmly. She picked up the contract and held it in front of them. This agreement was worth $1.2 billion to your company. It would have secured your future for the next 5 years. But some things are more important than money. With deliberate slowness, Diane tore the contract in half. Pareció. Sound of ripping paper seemed to fill the entire room. This meeting is over, gentlemen. TechGuard Solutions will not be doing business with Wellington Industries now or ever. The 4 men sat in stunned silence as the reality of what had just happened sank in. David looked like he might faint. The biggest deal in his company's history had just vanished because of his own cruelty. Security will escort you out, Diane said, pressing a button on the conference table. 2 professional security guards appeared at the door within seconds. As the Wellington Industries executives were led out of the building, David turned back one last time. You're making a huge mistake, Dr. Thompson. You'll regret this. Diane smiled, but it wasn't a cruel smile. It was the smile of someone who had just done the right thing even when it was difficult. Mr. Wellington, the only thing I regret is that it took me 3 years to realize what kind of person you really are. 6 months later, the consequences of that day were clear for everyone to see. Word had spread quickly through the business community about what had happened at TechGuard Solutions. Other companies began to question whether they wanted to work with Wellington Industries. 3 major contracts were canceled when the stories about employee mistreatment became public. The Department of Labor investigation resulted in huge fines. Wellington Industries' stock price fell by 60%, and David was forced to step down as CEO. Meanwhile, TechGuard Solutions grew stronger than ever. Companies were impressed by Diane's commitment to doing business with integrity. Her client list doubled, and she was invited to speak at conferences about ethical business practices. Most importantly, Diane had proven that success without character is meaningless and that treating people with respect isn't just the right thing to do, it's also good business.